Just over 40 years ago, and not more than a couple miles from where this class would normally be held, serial murderer Ted Bundy charmed his way into the Chi sorority house and slaughtered 2 girls attending FSU. Just over 45 years ago, drifter John Spankyling came into Tallahassee and murdered a man in a motel down the road from Florida State's campus. And nearly 50 years ago, a convicted serial rapist and murderer named John Wayne Gacy would begin a killing spree that left more than 30 young boys sodomized and brutally killed. While all 3 men are infamous for their heinous crimes, they are also tied together as some of the most notorious criminals to ever have their life stopped short because of the death penalty. The decision by a jury to end a criminal's life is by far the heaviest one they can make, and while no one will argue that their crimes are truly evil, the use of the death penalty has long been questioned for both its effectiveness as a deterrent and for its morality. Today, the death penalty is being carried out in the United States less frequently. However, when it does occur, news tends to spread quickly on social media sites like Facebook and Twitter, where more often than not, the sentiment is resoundingly against the death penalty. In fact, deathpenaltyinfo.org reports that national polling among Americans suggests they would prefer alternative sentences for the most violent criminals among us. Those in favor of the death penalty stake their case on the claim that it acts as a deterrent for criminal behavior. I would argue that these killers abandoned consideration for their own lives long before they began to take the lives of their fellow human beings. For this reason and others, I would interject that alternative punishments for the most violent criminals are more cost-effective, ethical, and a better deterrent for preventing these types of despicable acts. The first point to consider when acknowledging the better alternatives to the death penalty is just how much it costs taxpayers to finance the execution of these criminals. For every minute spent in the courtroom fighting these cases, the taxpayers of this country are being billed for the state's aggressive prosecution. In Florida alone, the pursuit of the death penalty costs taxpayers $51 million each year, more than if the state were to pursue the life in prison with no possibility of parole. An extra $51 million when there isn't a chance either way that these criminals would ever see sunlight again. To put that in perspective, with the money we save from forgoing the pursuit of capital punishment, the state of Florida would have enough funding to more than double the salaries of every public school teacher. Since the year 1972, the total sum spent fighting for executions in Florida amounts to more than $2.2 billion, or nearly $3 million, $23 million for each successful execution. Instead of spending so much time and money litigating to end a criminal's life, I would argue that this money could be better spent addressing the conditions of the 20% of Florida children living below the poverty line. According to a study conducted by the University of Manchester, growing up in poverty leads to children being 7 times more likely to commit self-harm or commit violent crimes as a young adult. Instead of blindly throwing money at symptoms of a problem, what we ought to be doing is spending that money to prevent children from ever growing up in a situation where crime is an acceptable act. The main argument used by advocates in favor of capital punishment is this concept that the death penalty will prevent criminals from committing violent acts. Purely from an anecdotal standpoint, we have acknowledged the state of Florida's adherence to the death penalty since the year 1979. Why then do individuals like Omar Mateen and Nicholas Cruz go on to perpetrate the 2 of the worst mass shootings that our country, let alone state, have ever seen? These 2 were clearly not deterred by the death penalty, nor the idea of death itself. They were both motivated by a hatred that clearly preceded any fear they had for the consequences of their actions. In fact, most serial killers exhibit signs of antisocial personality disorders that cause them to have disregard for the law, disregard for other people, and a lack of remorse or guilt. From a statistical standpoint, there is no significant difference between the crime rate of states with and without the death penalty. In fact, one potential drawback of the death penalty is that it lures the population into a false sense of complacency that the government is taking effective measures to combat crime. In reality, the death penalty does nothing to protect us or our communities from the acts of dangerous criminals, according to the ACLU. Finally, there's the question of morality. The 8th Amendment, an amendment so important it was enshrined in the Bill of Rights, states that cruel and unusual punishment shall not be inflicted on anybody in the United States. Now, the 2 questions we ask ourselves are as follows. Is capital punishment cruel? And is capital punishment unusual? If the death penalty were to be a swift execution of justice, no pun intended, then we might be able to say that no, it is in fact not cruel. However, it is not a rare occurrence for executions to be botched, leading to torturous, painful, and sometimes failed executions. According to deathpenaltyinfo.org, examples of botched executions include inmates catching fire while being electrocuted, being strangled during hangings instead of having their necks broken, and being administered the wrong dosages of specific drugs for lethal injections. These are all examples of the cruelty and unusuality of the death penalty. According to statistics, most people believe that the death penalty is not an effective form of punishment. The death penalty costs taxpayers a high amount of money, does not deter criminals or lower the crime rate, and its morality is questionable. Life imprisonment seems like a much better alternative punishment rather than the death penalty, and deters crime the same amount as the death penalty does. While many states have already abolished the death penalty, this form of capital punishment still exists. A good way to deal with this problem is to vote against it during elections, or even choosing not to vote for death penalty during a case while in jury duty. I hope this speech has shown you how alternatives to the death penalty are a better choice. Thanks.